Evolution.org, episode 613, coming your way. Today we're talking about Chris Tuttle Steroid Cycle. We're going to talk about his life. We're going to talk about his social media influence, all his diet stuff that he does, training, how he likes to train. We're going to kind of speculate on a steroid cycle based on what we know he likes and what he's talked about. So first, let's get into his early life. So he was born in Connecticut in 1983. He had to deal with hypoglycemia as a young man, not young man, as a young child, really. And he wasn't diagnosed until he was 10 years old. So look, at the end of the day, this actually turned out to be a blessing for him because this forced him and his parents to really start digging into this stuff, learn about eating healthy foods, learn about foods that fluctuate blood sugar up and down, and learn how to spread out healthy carbs throughout the day to
Yeah.
keep that condition under control. So a lot of times, especially in those days during the 80s and 90s, they were misdiagnosing. It's very easy to misdiagnose, especially with children. It's just like when you take your cat or a dog to the vet, it's the same thing, because it's very difficult on parents. So I went through something similar too growing up as well, where they couldn't figure out what was wrong. Now I know as an adult through trial and error to avoid certain foods. And that forced me to study about diet and nutrition. That's why I know so much about it. So Chris went through the same thing. He was forced to educate himself on diet and nutrition because of this reason. He wasn't one of those people who could just eat whatever they wanted growing up. And, I'm sure his friends would, be eating cookies and cake and ice cream and all this junk food. And he had to be careful. He couldn't eat that crap. He had to be careful about the stuff he was putting in his body. So it ended up being really a blessing in disguise because it
Yeah.
made him want to educate himself on it and want him to gain knowledge on it. So he had to do it out of necessity for his own health. So here's the cool thing is he earned a bachelor's degree in nutrition and dietetics from University of New Haven, and then he completed an internship at Stony Brook University Hospital in New York. He then got a master's degree in nutrition from the University of St. Joseph. So Chris has always leaned on nutrition. Look, and he's not only for himself, but also with his clients as well. And this is one of the advantages that he has in the industry is all his education on the subject and what he went through growing up. Other guys don't have that. So we see a lot of these pro bodybuilders, they'll do videos and they don't really talk deep into nutrition. Because they don't know. They just know shove steroids up my ass, go lift weights for 45 minutes an hour, and that's it, and go home, and boom, you'll build muscle because it works for them. They didn't never had to specifically study nutrition and get into it. Chris did. So this is one of the things that him and I have in common, and that's one of the things I like about him. Another cool thing, and I'll bring in Mobster to kind of talk more about this as well, is his competitive nature. And one of the things he got into as a young man, while in college, was motocross, and that's really a dangerous sport. But it's one of those sports where you can go out there and break a bone. You can really severely injure yourself when you go out there. So it really takes a lot of balls to do that type of thing. But he really enjoyed it. He decided later on to switch gears and focus on bodybuilding. So he started competing, in the 2000s, and we'll kind of go over his different placings. Mobster, do you want to touch
Yeah,
on?
sorry, I'm just thinking, Steve, he actually gets teased a little bit by some of the guys on the Ask Me Anything podcast that he does about his comments on carbohydrates and so on and so forth. It's also interesting to think about we might actually be setting kids up for health issues because we don't always give them healthy food. And it's interesting for me that he responded specifically to healthy food, which has actually set him up for life in a great way. And especially, he said, how many top bodybuilders do we know that are specifically qualified in the areas that they're giving practical conversations and information out about? And Chris is probably one of I can maybe think of 3 or 4 pros in the last 20 years that are actually qualified in nutrition, exercise science, whatever, in that particular regards. Ben Palowski is another one, I believe, is qualified in terms of exercise science and actually studied at a university to degree level, Steve. So it's fascinating that he's had to learn how to eat healthy versus the idea that you can throw junk food at kids and they'll be fine. That's, arguably some of the crap that we do with the white bread springs to mind or whatever else. Also, the competitive nature. I like that, Steve. I don't think my own particular one developed to perhaps literally the age of 15, as I described when my balls dropped, and then all of a sudden I suddenly become properly interested in sports and whatever else, almost as I was finished at school. So it's interesting again that he's again, we see this a lot with pro bodybuilders when they switch over from one sport to another and find their niche. And the last thing that springs to mind, and this was just in the show that I was watching yesterday as podcast research for us today, was of the 3 or 4 people that were doing an Ask Me Anything, Antoine, Evan Centopani himself, and one other athlete. He was the one that was vascular. He was the one that was in condition. So the guys were teasing him a little bit. But again, this is because he has to have nutrition on point all the time. And arguably, that, of course, is what we should all be fucking doing, Steve. So, yeah, it's interesting for that. Get into, as you say, the competition history for our listeners, just to see where he's placed and give them an idea of what kind of bodybuilder he is.
2005 NPC East Coast Classic, 5th place, novice middleweight. 2006 NPC Gold's Gym Classic, 2nd place, open light heavyweight. 1st place, light heavyweight, novice and overall winner. The next year in 2007, he had a couple good competitions. NPC Gold's Gym Classic, 3rd place. And then the NPC Eastern USA, 16th place, open light heavyweight. 2008, NPC Bev Francis Atlantic States, 1st place, open heavyweight. 2009 Junior Nationals, 9th place heavyweight. And then in 2012, he had a couple good wins. Vermont State Championship, 1st place. NPC Jay Cutler Classic, 1st place. Overall winner in both. And then 2013, he had a couple good showings. IFBB North Americans, 5th place. NBC Nationals, 1st place light heavyweight. Peak statistics, I've seen him up to 240 pounds, depending on where you're looking. But really, basically 5'9", 225. I've seen him anywhere from 212 up to 240, with the average being about 225. So
note, Steve, most of those wins or placements were light heavy. So he has been a heavy and won, but for the benefit of listeners, his best seems to be light heavy. In fact, arguably at 5'9", and as you said, as low as 212. There's an argument for the 212 class that he might well have been amazing, but he's not made that particular choice. But it's interesting to see he's stayed pretty much light heavy for nearly every single competition placement or win. That seems to be, with apart from the very first novice middleweight, the rest of there. So he realizes that's where he's at his best. So that's an interesting point right there.
Yeah, it's something to do with his height too, because he's not one of the taller bodybuilders, almost 6 foot guys, but he's also not one of the short little 5'4", 5'5", 5'6" guys. He's sort of in the middle. So height makes a difference. When you're on stage, you're 5'9", 225. The guy next to you is 5'6", 225. Who's going to look bigger? Obviously, the 5'6" guy.
Yeah. Their local pro. Let me just touch on that, Steve. Our local former IFBB pro bodybuilder is probably maybe 5'9" himself, but he's never been super competitive as a heavyweight. He tried going up to 100 kilos, which was 220 pounds. It was horrendous. And I've actually seen him in probably the best condition he was ever in, maybe twice in his career. And that was around 180 pounds. I believe he was the lightest on the Olympia stage when he competed one year, made it to the Olympia stage before the 212 class even existed. And that was around 168 pounds. So, we've talked about this, and I think he said something to the effect of, if I'd have gone and done the 212 class, and in order to be competitive, I would have had to been as ripped the fuck, I'd have been giving nearly 40 pounds away to the other 212 class lifters, the other bodybuilders. So you go with what works. You do. 5'9" is probably actually average for a competing bodybuilder in terms of height. But look at him, he weighs 225. Arnold is very, very close. I think 6'1" and a bit. Was 225 in the 1975 Pumping Iron Mr. Olympia. So that's just to give you an idea, listeners. 5'9" is probably the average height for the majority of bodybuilders. And if you can pack muscle onto that frame and look good. But as Steve says, if someone standing next to him is 1 inch or 2 inches shorter and weighs the same, they just look that much thicker. But Chris has done incredibly well. I'd actually argue, Steve, that both the Nationals and the Jay Cutler Classic were the two big ones in there. The others are all good competitions, but you seem to get noticed more at the Nationals, and certainly Jay Cutler's competition has been one that people started paying attention to almost from the get-go. Let's move on to his activity on social media.
So he's very active on social media. We see him on podcasts. We see him on interviews. He likes to talk. He's pretty good on there, and he's also involved with his wife. And his wife Alexia, she's also a very well educated person in nutrition. So they grow their fitness business together. She has a big following as well on social, and he's got several different businesses. He's got coaching that he does. He's got supplements that he promotes. He's got discount codes for them. Of course, he gets a commission when you buy the supplements using his code.
Yeah.
He's got the podcast he does. And he also has, I saw a real estate business. I'm not sure if his real estate business is still going, but he does have a link to a real estate business. So I'm not really sure.
I think the answer is yes, Steve. Tuttle Realty was a plate or looked like a trophy or something behind him in one of the videos that I watched. So I'm going to say yes.
Yeah. So it's probably like a side gig he does. And a lot of people do that. They have a realtor's license and they sell homes on the side and they make some extra money doing that. And believe me, you can make a lot of good money, off the commission. If you're getting 3% commission off every home you sell, right? Then if you sell one house every couple months, that's a big paycheck you're getting. So why not, right? So when it comes to diet, this is the cream of the crop here. So Chris, obviously he has an ideology based on his history growing up where he wants to, promote a certain diet ideology. So let's kind of get into it. And, some of the stuff can apply to you. Some of it may not apply to you. So one of the things he likes to do is keep things simple. He likes to keep things fun and he likes to keep things exciting so people don't stray from their diet. So I'm going to go over some of the tips that he's talked about extensively that I saw. So one of the things he says is prep your food for 3 to 4 days only. This way they stay fresh and you make sure you store them properly. So instead of storing food for the entire week, he's saying just prepare to store for 3 to 4 days. This way it doesn't go stale. Another thing is food prep 15 minutes per day versus just 2 hours a week, which goes into the first point. This way you're constantly having more food. You're prepping ahead of time. You're staying ahead of the game. This way you don't run out of food. And then this way you don't have the temptation to go out to eat or do the Uber Eats or whatever and get junk food delivered to your house or get a pizza delivered to your house. Another thing he says is rotate your meals so you don't get bored. Mobster, if you want to jump in any of these, I mean, you're welcome to if you want to touch on any of this.
Yeah, the one that grabs my attention, Steve, and I've actually talked about this, even when you're in competition prep, especially food competition prep, okay? And it can be incredibly restricting. One of the things that stands out here, Steve, is this: flavor your foods with spices, citrus, etc. Listen, we've done podcasts, Steve and I, when we talked about, food prepping chicken breast, food prepping rice. Steve touched on multiple uses of a rice cooker the other day. You've got those air fryer type things, etc. Steve, and I've said, if we talked about 20-something chicken breasts, I said, why don't you do different herbs, different seasonings? You can make these things yourself, and you can buy ones that are low sodium, and literally just flavor the chicken breast a particular way. There's a local butcher that delivers that their foundation of what made them. I think they're actually called Muscle something or other. That's how they got started, Steve, with supplying chicken breast to rugby players, and they do 3 or 4 different, like a Chinese flavored and Asian flavor. And that way you don't have to have, you're restricted because of your prep food, but you aren't restricted in flavor, and that keeps it interesting. That keeps it quote unquote fresh, so that even if you are having fucking chicken breast and tuna every goddamn day, it doesn't have to taste the goddamn same, and it makes it more palatable. So that's really, really, I like that particular one. And then things like here, Steve, stop using garlic and onion to flavor food. For some people, I believe this would apply, as they can cause gas and bloating over time. That makes a lot of sense as well, especially if you want that flat stomach for a competition. And again, why eat food that you might like the taste of? I'm like this with chocolate, Steve. I cannot eat chocolate because it as tasty as I might think it is, dark chocolate, whatever, it will fuck my stomach up. I can't do it anymore. So why eat foods that you don't get on with? That absolutely makes sense. What do you think on that, Steve?
Yeah, so his wife, I saw she did some type of certification or something in FODMAP eating. And FODMAP is something that I never heard of until maybe 7, 8 years ago. And now, because I talk about it so much on the forums, people are starting to kind of get it. I have clients that come to me with this issue. They're like, I have these problems, they digest the problems. And I'm like, well, what did you eat today? They're like, oh, I just had some chicken. I said, what did you flavor the chicken with? They're like, oh, I put some garlic in it. I'm like, there you go. Stop consuming the garlic. They're like, I eat garlic every single day with almost every meal. I'm like, there you go. That's your problem. So basically what's happening is the garlic and onion in your gut is causing a lot of inflammation, hence why you're having these problems. So just cut out the garlic and onion out of your diet, cut out all the high FODMAP foods out of your diet, and you'll notice a big change. So his wife that's why he mentions that, because his wife is probably in his ear telling him, because she studied this as well. So this is a great way for many of you out there who are consuming a lot of garlic and onions every day. Try eliminating it from your diet, and I guarantee that you'll notice a big change to your gut. So listen to Chris and his wife on this one. And then a couple more things, fruits and vegetables, keep a variety. There's a reason certain fruits and veggies are only seasonal certain times a year. That's the way humans evolved. We evolved. We only had access to a certain fruit or vegetable, whatever time of year, and nature would bring it to us or nature would take it away. So do that same thing. When it's in season, eat it. When it's not in season, then there's no reason to necessarily go for it. So keep a variety of it and keep switching it up. And then fish and red meat, one of his tips on that is eat it as soon as possible after cooking, because that way it's more fresh. And I agree with that. Like, fish is one of those things where it should be treated very delicately. I'm a fisherman. When I catch fish, I clean them immediately. I ice them. I vacuum seal them, and I put them in the freezer. And then the day before I plan on use it, then I put it in the fridge overnight, and then I cook it. You want to keep fish as fresh as possible. And the same thing with red meat. I agree with that. So, Mobster, why don't you touch on his training, and then we'll get into a steroid cycle.
Yeah, on the training stuff here, Steve, and I've just had a thought replying to this. So there's a couple of sort of rules almost, and I'll read the rules first, right? Number one is he says he doesn't think he trains a body part more than 6 times a month. So that's going to be every roughly 4 or 5 days-ish. So that's number one. Number two, he stopped training to failure some time ago. So that's almost a rule again. And the main reason for that was, while it is okay to train to failure, it was ultimately over time and over the period of a training cycle, limiting his ability to recover. So in other words, it would be probably even less times per month, Steve, because it was taking longer to recover, because he was pounding the fuck out of it when he did train it, and yet at the same time wasn't making progress. And progress, as I say, Steve, on the forums, is key. People say, what do you think of this routine? And I always say, are you making progress? If the answer is yes, keep doing it. It's great. If the answer is no, stop doing it. Change it. It's not that complicated. It really is that fucking simple sometimes. And Chris has kind of worked that out for himself. If I train 6 times a month, I progress, but not if I push to failure all the goddamn time. So there's an example. As an example of a workout, Steve, I chose back, which is a good, easy video to watch, no problem. But again, he says he doesn't do the same sets and rep frequency ever. It's never the same from one back session to the next back session to the next back session. So he's always looking to vary the reps. But that could be as simple as just progressive reps, Steve, 10 ones, 12 the next time, 14 the time after that, and so on and so forth. Or literally doing a different rep and setup. But here's an example, Steve, was close grip, pull downs using a mag grip handle. We've got some of those at our local gym. They're kind of cool. And the reps are not fast. They're not crazy slow. It's not super slow, but it's a up and down pace, a tick-tock type pace. No fast on this part or slow on that part. It's pull down in a slow position, go up in a slow position, and a very nice tempo to it. So I kind of like that, Steve. He maintains an upright position and was doing 4 to 5 sets. Another big one.
So let me just jump in. Let me jump in for you. It seems like when it comes to his training and his diet, he's a big believer in change. Keep changing things up. And that kind of keeps the body off pace, and it kind of trains the body for any
I would
situation.
argue against it, Steve, because the thing of it is, right, and there's an argument you and I have used before. If you're a professional bodybuilder, your genetics is going to be amazing. So I suspect, and we've actually had this debate with members on the forums, it's mental over physical. Because if you're a normal Joe, I would rather you stick to a program that works, even if that's for months and months and months, so long as you're progressing, versus the need to change it up all the time and not know if you progress because of this workout or the other workout. And keeping it simple is probably the best approach. However, Chris is a professional bodybuilder. He's training a lot. He's giving out coaching advice a lot. And I think the mental stimulus, if he did the same thing all the time, so
I almost think maybe he has like ADHD where he gets bored with the
maybe,
same routine.
maybe.
So
And
he
he
kind
comes,
of, it seems
yeah, he
like from
comes
his
across a little
videos,
bit like that.
I
Yeah.
get that sense from him. He's a little more
Yes.
energetic. He needs a
Yes, I was about
little
to say
bit
the same
more.
thing. Just in the way that he talks to the guys, he
Yeah.
responds very, very quickly.
It
His
seems
mind
like
is
he's the type of
100 miles an
person,
hour.
they'll go to the gym, they'll change up workout partners all the time, they'll go different times,
Maybe.
they'll change gyms all the times. They've got to have that stimuli. They got to go buy
Yes.
a pair of shoes
Yes.
or a pair of,
Something
some
like that.
new
Yeah.
clothes. So that's what it comes out. And Mobster, you're the opposite. You like routine, you like the same thing.
All right.
So
I
yeah,
will do one thing which I think applies here, Steve, and I've actually mentioned this a couple of times on the forum, as you're well aware. Right. So I don't do the same leg workout each time I go to the gym. I rotate 3 big core exercises for legs in terms of the Hatfield squat, the lever squat, and a power squat. Assuming I don't break the fucking machine like I nearly did on Monday. Same thing for back. I train bench, as you know, every goddamn Friday, and I've been doing that probably for the best part of a year in the way that I've been doing it. But I will vary the back workout. It's all for the same thing: middle back, high back thickness, which helps my bench. But if I did the same goddamn exercise, I think I'd fuck my joint something chronic. There are other exercises which you know. I mean, in arms, I've just started. I don't do the same arm workout. One's a kind of light-ish bicep workout with heavy press downs, and the other one is super fucking heavy hammer curls with super heavy fucking skull crushers. But it's not the same workout every time. And what that's allowed me to do, and it might apply to Chris here as well, is extend the time that I can keep hitting something and also not fuck my joints up. Let's get into the steroid stuff. So I'm going to start this, preface this, and I sent this in the show notes to Steve, just to let you know what he did at the beginning. And then we're going to get into what we think he does for competitions or the last time he competed. So, for example, Steve, he talks about a product called Dancal T400 and 200 Deca. And specifically, he paid $700, Steve. Knew next to nothing about what he was doing. Didn't realize how much. He thought that's what it cost. God damn, he'd be lucky to pay that now. It was just, but he didn't realize he was being ripped off. Knew nothing about putting syringes, pinning. He fucked up. He went and had to go to different pharmacies, was asking for vet products. He had no idea, Steve. It took him a while to learn. He was pyramiding, which you don't really need to do, up and down on a cycle, and yet gained on his very first cycle, see, 17 pounds and managed to keep 13 pounds, which is fucking amazing, especially at 5'9". Didn't use an AI and just did this repeatedly, I believe at least 4 times before starting to learn something. Something else, which we'll touch on briefly. He says he's never used more than 60 micrograms of Clen. You and I have done podcasts on Clen, of course, talking up to 120, the frequency you should use it, and so on and so forth. And he says, in terms of his steroid cycles, and I've added an additional note here, Steve, big on nutrition. In other words, applying the right nutrition when on steroids to get the most out of it. We see a few of the younger listeners and members on the forum that seem to think take steroids, grow. No, you still need to train your asses off. You still need to be big on nutrition. I think we could argue, Steve, because he says he's never used more than 60 micrograms of Clen, that he's definitely using Clen to get into shape. And I think even what you said about the hyper, maybe mentality, the ADHD type personality, suggests if he went to 120 micrograms, he'd be a fucking lunatic. It'd be all over the place.
I think
Yeah, go on.
also the time he came around to bodybuilding, he would have been in his early 20s. And I
Yes.
think that in that era, because he was born in 83, so we're talking about the early 2000s.
Yes.
Clen was very common. Clen was very common, especially in bodybuilding, not for powerlifters, not for bulky
No, no.
guys, but if people who like to be lean and they like to bodybuild, Clen was very popular in those days. I think now it's less so popular. But here's the thing, old school habits, don't go away. So in his situation, he knows that Clen works for him. So he's going to go
Yes.
back and tap back into the honey pot for it. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
the T400 and the Decker worked. We know he did because of the 17 pounds, keeping 13 pounds. So here's the thing again for the listeners' benefit. You go if two things apply here. One, the lack of information, which only really started in 2000, and he would have been very early stages of that. As Steve, he would have been 17, 18 years of age. And so he really wouldn't have been paying much attention to that at the time. And again, not like anything like what it is now in terms of access to information. Hence, him paying way too much for what he was buying even then. Secondly, if it works, why the fuck would you change it? Why would you take that out? If he knows that 60 micrograms is perfect for him, and I'm telling you now, listeners, that he's in great condition, sitting there, quote unquote, retired. I can see that he's still got maybe another competition or two in if he wants to, Steve. Then you would keep using what works. He knows he can grow on T400. He knows he can grow on the 200 milligrams of Deca per week. So stay the fuck on that if that's what you want to. Obviously, as you get the competitive levels, and this is where we're going to get into it now, we would say that he's going to perhaps still use what he did, but he would up the dosages. And that's out of pure necessity. In order to be super competitive on stage, 400 and 200 milligrams of Deca a week's not going to cut it, Steve. So we're probably looking at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 milligrams of some kind of testosterone. And certainly in the early part of a competition stack, the Deca, maybe not so much towards the end. He doesn't really mention oral, Steve, but I still think he would probably be using something like Anavar in there. And again, just for the condition, the shape and size, I can see him typically, which is not unusual for a competing bodybuilder, the 100 milligrams per day. He doesn't really talk about, but I think you and I can second guess this a little bit. I can't see him using a lot of insulin just for his size, his frame, the condition, but I could see him using growth, Steve, certainly for tissue repair. Again, this is from the training information he's given us. Again, just looking at him competitively, the physique that he's presenting to us, etc., etc. Absolutely, I would argue against anybody that disagrees with this. I can certainly see him using some trends, Steve, but again, in his particular case, probably the lower end. And for competitive high level, as he has been, competing bodybuilders, not as low as, say, 300. I'm going to think 600, 800 milligrams would not be too far off to think. And master on, Steve. So what do you think? Anything else in here that we're not including? I'm only
so.
saying
This is the
insulin.
way probably his
Yeah.
competition stack went. I would say 60 micrograms Clen per day,
Yep.
600 milligrams testosterone, Deca
Yep.
800 milligrams to start, but then he drops it off
Yes.
4 weeks
Yes.
prior.
Yes.
And then the Masteron, he probably kept high 1,200 milligrams. The trend, like you said, somewhere around 500 to 700 milligrams per week max, but then he
Because of
drop
his
it.
physique. Yes. Yes.
Using it with Clen would be really tough. So obviously he would drop it when he needed to drop it. And then with the HGH, I'd say 12 IUs, especially in that era. That would have been ample.
And
Now
again,
they're
because of the physique is presenting, I'm going to agree. Nothing, certainly not the higher amounts that we've seen. And in his case, I'm not going to say insulin, purely and simply because of physique, his height, his frame, etc. He would be 240, 250 and kind of soft looking, I think,
But I think
because of
I
the way he
think
presents
when you're using
himself.
HGH that high, you definitely need the insulin. So I would say
Yes,
not
exactly.
only I'd say the insulin though, he wouldn't use it like throughout the day, but I'd say he target the short acting insulin before big meals. That would
Yeah,
be his
yeah.
target. And then one more that I would add in there is thyroid medication. Because if you're using that much HGH with the insulin, thyroid medication would be important. It's going to help you stay lean. It's going to help you balance those that you're using. It's also going to help with the trend because trend really wreaks havoc too on your metabolism. So thyroid meds would be really, really good to keep your metabolism nice and strong to stay lean. So I think that's pretty much what he did. And also, the kind of again, it's really not that surprising any of this, especially where I see where Mobster did a great job looking into this, where he didn't use an AI originally when he first got into it. That's not
Yeah.
surprising because in those days, a lot of guys either they get their information from their buddies, and their buddies weren't giving them the best information.
No,
They
that's
weren't giving
true.
them, and he overpaid for steroids his first time.
Oh,
I
Christ,
did
man.
as well because in that time you would get a steroid source from a buddy, and I ordered it. And the reason when I ordered it was so fucking expensive is I ordered it from like an international source, and they obviously, dealing with Americans, and having to get it through customs and all that. But the thing is, they know, hey, Americans have money. Let's rip them off. Let's overcharge them. And there wasn't that many options. So really, I had to overpay, but that's how it was in those days. So a lot of the stuff that he went through in the early 2000s is stuff that I went through, that Mobster went through. So it's not surprising to see this. But obviously, over time, I'm sure he's gotten more knowledgeable on proper
That was
steroids.
going to be my next thought, Steve. I think what we're also looking at here is the conversations we had in the early part of the show, listeners, when we talked about the nutritional aspect and what he can and can't do. So there's also an element for me if I don't see him getting crazy out of shape and whatever else. Listen, the number one thing I think he does, and this is the biggest benefit for us as when we're putting out his shows, is he's made himself educated and he's out there working with clients, putting out this information, and he's literally degree qualified in the knowledge that he applies both to himself, which is super beneficial, of course, and to those people that he's working with, Steve. And he knows probably better than most top bodybuilders just exactly how his body works. So that's something you should do. You should always learn all the time, top up the information all the time. And if you can actually get qualified, that's fantastic, even if it's just for your own benefit, Steve. Please note, we are not doctors and opinions. Ours is our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. A podcast of informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.